Mr. Messy was the messiest person you've ever met in your whole life. He looked messy because he was messy in everything he did. You could always tell where Mr. Messy had been because he left a trail of messy fingerprints wherever he'd been. Oh, yes, Mr. Messy was messy by name, messy by nature. Mr. Messy lived in a particularly messy-looking house. Paint was peeling, windows were broken, there were tiles missing from the roof. The flower beds were overgrown with weeds, and the garden gate was off its hinges. And had Mr. Messy cut the grass in his garden lately? He had not. One morning, Mr. Messy woke up in his messy bed, yawned, scratched, got up, cleaned his teeth, leaving the top off the toothpaste, had his breakfast, spilling cornflakes all over the floor, and then set out for a walk, tripping over a brush he'd left lying in the garden 2 weeks before. There was a wood behind Mr. Messy's messy house with the messy garden, and that's where he went for his walk. It was a particularly large wood with lots and lots of trees, and it took Mr. Messy a long time to walk through it. But he didn't really mind because he felt like walking that morning. So he walked right through the wood until he came to the other side. And you know what he found on the other side of the wood? Mr. Messy found the neatest, prettiest-looking little cottage that he had ever seen. It had a lovely little garden with a stream running through the middle of it. There was a man in the garden clipping the hedge. He looked up as Mr. Messy approached. "Morning. I'm Mr. Messy," said Mr. Messy. "I can see that," replied the man, looking you up and down. "I'm Mr. Tidy." "And I'm Mr. Neat," said another man, peering out of the house. "Tidy and neat," said Mr. Tidy. "Neat and tidy," said Mr. Neat. We're in business together," explained Mr. Tidy. "And the people who own this house have asked us to do some work for them." "What sort of work?" asked Mr. Messy. "Oh, we make things nice and neat," said Mr. Neat. "Tidy things up," added Mr. Tidy. Perhaps we could come along and do some work for you," said Mr. Neat, looking at Mr. Messy, who was looking even messier than usual that particular morning. "But I know one thing is neat and tidy," said Mr. Messy, looking downright miserable at the thought of it. "Nonsense," said Mr. Tidy. "Fiddlesticks," said Mr. Neat. "But," said Mr. Messy. "Come along," said Mr. Neat. "Off we go," said Mr. Tidy. But, said Mr. Messy. "But nothing," said Mr. Neat. And bundling him into their van, which was parked behind the house, off they went to Mr. Messy's house on the other side of the wood. "Good heavens," said Mr. Neat, when he saw where Mr. Messy lived. "Good gracious me," added Mr. Tidy. "This is the messiest house I've ever seen in all my born days," they both said together at the same time. "Better do something about it," said Mr. Neat. And before Mr. Messy could open his mouth, the two of them were rushing here and there about Mr. Messy's house. Mr. Neat hoed, and mowed, and pruned, and snipped, and clipped, and cleared, and dug, and made the garden look neater than it had ever looked before. Mr. Tidy cleaned, and primed, and rubbed, and painted, and mended, and made the house of Mr. Messy look tidier than it had ever looked before. Then they both went inside the house. "Good heavens," said Mr. Neat for the second time that morning. "Good gracious," said Mr. Tidy for the second time that morning. And then they set about cleaning the house from top to bottom. They brushed and swept and polished and scrubbed and made the inside of the house look neater and tidier than it had ever looked before. "There we are," said Mr. Tidy. "All finished," said Mr. Neat. "Tidy and neat," said Mr. Tidy. "Neat and tidy," said Mr. Neat. Mr. Messy just didn't know what to say. Then they both looked at Mr. Messy. "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" Mr. Neat said to Mr. Tidy. "Precisely," said Mr. Tidy. What we're both thinking, boy," they said together to Mr. Messy, "is that Now the house is so neat and tidy. You are much too messy to live in it. But, said Mr. Messy. But whatever Mr. Messy said was no use, and Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy whisked him off to the bathroom upstairs. It had been the messiest room in the house, but now, of course, it was as bright as a new pin. Then Mr. Neat got hold of one of Mr. Messy's arms, and Mr. Tidy got hold of the other arm, and they picked him up and put him straight into the bath. Mr. Messy wasn't used to having baths. Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy washed, and brushed, and cleaned, and scrubbed, and combed Mr. Messy until he didn't look like Mr. Messy at all. In fact, he looked the opposite of messy. He looked at himself in the mirror. You know what I'm going to have to do now, he said in a rather fierce voice. Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy looked worried. What are you going to have to do? They asked Mr. Messy. I'm going to have to change my name, said Mr. Messy. And they chuckled. And Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy chuckled. Then Mr. Messy laughed. And Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy laughed. And they all laughed together and became the best of friends. Mr. Mean lived up to his name. He lived in what could have been a nice house, but wasn't. He never painted it, or mended the windows, or repaired the roof. Inside it was the same. No carpets, no curtains, no pictures, no fires. And Mr. Mean was so mean he made his furniture out of old orange boxes and then complained about the price of nails. Why, he was so mean. Do you know what he gave his brother for Christmas last year? A piece of coal. It wasn't as if Mr. Mean didn't have any money. Oh, no. He had lots of money. But would he spend it? Not old Meanie. Not if he could help it. One day he was sitting in his gloomy kitchen having a gloomy meal when there was a knock at the door. Drat, he said, because he didn't like people. Drat and bother. He opened the door, and there on his doorstep stood a wizard. A rather fat wizard.
Hello,
said the wizard.
I wonder if, by any chance, as it's such a warm day, you could possibly, if it's not too much trouble, be so kind as to, if it's not inconvenient, perhaps, as I'm very thirsty, provide me with, do you think, a glass, if it's not too much to ask, of water, please?
He was a very wordy wizard. No, replied Mr. Mean rudely, and shut the door in his face. How did you get in?
Well,
replied the wizard,
it was by, how shall I put it, I just, well, you know, waved the old what's-his-name magic wand, don't you know, and then, you know, well, here I am, if you know what I mean. You must be very poor,
he remarked kindly, looking round. Oh, yes, I am, lied Mr. Mean.
Then perhaps I can help you,
said the wizard, pulling up a box to sit down on. The box didn't move, so the wizard pulled it harder, and this time it did move. In fact, it tipped up and spilled Mr. Mean's money all over the floor.
Well. It would appear to me that you, sir, are an old meanie.
Mr. Meanie didn't hear him. He was too busy scrabbling all over the floor trying to pick up his money.
And meanies need to be taught a lesson.
And so saying, he waved his magic wand. All the money turned into potatoes. Potatoes. Oh, dear. Oh, dear me. Oh, dear me. Please turn my money back into money. Oh, please.
Perhaps,
replied the wizard.
But on the other hand, taking all things into account, by and large, things being what they are on the face of it, perhaps not. However,
continued the wordy wizard.
If you make me a solemn promise never to be mean again, then I'll turn the potatoes back into money. But,
he added sternly,
if you are ever mean again, then it's, how shall I put it, then it's potatoes for you, my lad, if not other vegetables as well.
The following day, Mr. Mean decided to walk to town. He never took the bus, because that cost money. On the way, he met an old washerwoman carrying an enormous bundle of washing. "Oh, please, kind sir," he said. "Could you possibly help me to carry this washing? It's so heavy." "No," replied Mr. Mean. "It's your washing. You carry it." But as soon as he'd said that, he felt a tingling in his nose. Mr. Mean's nose turned into a carrot. "Oh, no!" he gasped. The old washerwoman chuckled. And then Mr. Mean remembered the wizard's words. "Yes, oh yes," he cried in a panic. "Of course I'll help you, of course." And the carrot turned back into her nose, and off he went. The old washerwoman chuckled again, and turned back into the wizard. It had been him all along, you see. Then Mr. Mean passed by a cottage garden. In the garden there was an old man chopping wood.
Excuse me, he called. Could you give an old man a bit of a hand, young fellow, my lad?
"No," replied Mr. Mean. "It's your wood. You chop it." But as soon as the words had passed his lips, guess what happened? His ears turned into tomatoes. "Oh, no," he gasped. The old man chuckled. Mr. Mean remembered the wizard's words. "Oh, yes, yes," he cried. "Yes, of course I'll give you a hand, of course." And he chopped and chopped until all the wood was cut. And the tomatoes turned back into ears, and off he went. Eventually, Mr. Mean arrived in the town. There was a little boy crying because his ball had got stuck on the top of the wall.
"Oh, please, sir, could you make my ball down for me?"
"No," retorted Mr. Mean. "Your ball, you..." Then he stopped. There was a funny tingling feeling in his feet. Yes, he said hurriedly. "Yes, of course I will, of course." And he reached up and passed the ball to the boy and went on his way, looking anxiously at his feet. The little boy stopped crying and turned into the wizard.
"I think," he said to himself, "I think that Mr. Mean, by and large, is beginning, if I'm not very much mistaken, to be not quite so mean. And I think, although I could be wrong, although I never am, that he has, thank goodness, learned his lesson."
And you know something? Mr. Mean had learned his lesson. Today, he's nothing like so mean as he used to be. And he doesn't keep his money in a box in the kitchen anymore. Today, his house is mended and painted and spick and span. And he's turned into quite a generous sort of fellow. Goodness, he's so generous. Do you know what he gave his brother last Christmas? 2 pieces of coal.